Right now, somewhere in the world, a grown adult is pouring a glass of cold milk and drinking it without a second thought. That sounds completely ordinary, but from a biological standpoint, what that person is doing is one of the strangest things a mammal has ever done. Every mammal on Earth loses the ability to digest milk after infancy. Every single one. Dogs, cats, whales, chimpanzees, all of them. Their bodies shut off the enzyme that processes lactose once they are weaned because there is simply no reason to keep producing it. Except for a specific group of humans who carry a genetic mutation that appeared only a few thousand years ago, a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. What nobody knew for most of human history was that the ability to drink milk as an adult was never normal. It was, and still is, a biological accident, one that ended up changing the trajectory of entire civilizations. This is the story of how a simple white liquid altered the human genome, toppled public health, built global empires, and became one of the most controversial drinks on the planet. Milk's origin story starts long before farms, long before agriculture, long before humans had any concept of domesticating animals. For hundreds of thousands of years, the relationship between humans and large mammals was straightforward. We hunted them. They ran away. Sometimes we succeeded and ate well for a week. Sometimes the animal won and somebody did not come home. That was the deal. The idea of walking up to a wild aurochs, a massive horned ancestor of modern cattle that stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed well over 2,000 pounds, and trying to squeeze liquid from its body would have been suicidal. These were not gentle farm animals. They were aggressive, territorial, explosively fast, and built like armored trucks. Nobody was milking anything. But something changed around 12,000 years ago in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from modern-day Iraq through Syria and down into Israel and Jordan. The last ice age was ending. Temperatures were rising. Glaciers were retreating north. Grasslands were expanding where frozen tundra used to be. Humans who had spent millennia as nomadic hunter-gatherers started settling down near reliable water sources along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They began planting seeds on purpose instead of just gathering whatever they found. They began storing grain in clay pits. And slowly, over generations, they began capturing and breeding wild animals, selecting the ones that were smaller, calmer, less likely to gore you to death, and easier to manage in a pen. Goats were probably the first to be domesticated around 10,000 BCE. They were small, ate almost anything, and reproduced quickly. Sheep followed shortly after. Then a few thousand years later, the big prize, cattle, descended from those terrifying aurochs, but bred down over centuries into something a farmer could actually work with. The initial motivation for keeping all of these animals was meat, hides, and bone tools. Milk was not on anyone's agenda, and for a very simple reason: adult humans could not digest it. Drinking raw milk as a grown adult in the ancient world would have caused bloating, cramps, nausea, diarrhea, and severe digestive distress. Your body simply did not produce the enzyme needed to break down lactose, the primary sugar in milk, past the age of about 5 or 6. Once you were weaned, that biological door closed permanently for everyone. So for the first few thousand years of animal domestication, milk was essentially a waste product for adults, useful only for feeding animal young and human infants who still had their lactase production running. That was about to change, but not in the way you might expect. Here is where the story gets clever. Sometime around 7000 BCE, humans in the Fertile Crescent figured out something that would reshape their entire relationship with the animals they kept. They discovered that if you left milk sitting out in a warm clay pot for a while, something interesting happened. Bacteria that were naturally present in the environment would begin breaking down the lactose, converting it into lactic acid. The milk thickened, it soured, and the result was something like yogurt, a tangy, protein-rich substance that even lactose-intolerant adults could eat without their stomachs turning inside out. Take it a step further by adding rennet from the stomach lining of a young calf, applying heat and pressure, draining the liquid away, pressing what remained into a solid block, and you got cheese. A primitive cheese, sure, but cheese nonetheless. Harder cheeses had even less lactose than soft ones. Aged cheeses had almost none at all. Archaeologists have found milk fat residue trapped inside pottery fragments at sites across modern-day Turkey, Eastern Europe, and the Saharan region of Africa, dating back nearly 9,000 years. These ancient people were not drinking milk straight. They were processing it, transforming it into something their bodies could handle. Cheese was not a gourmet treat. It was a hack, a biochemical workaround for a biological limitation that every adult human on Earth shared at the time. And that workaround changed the economics of farming overnight. Think about the math. A cow that you slaughter gives you meat once. A cow that you keep alive and milk, or whose milk you turn into cheese and yogurt, gives you food day after day, month after month for years. A herd of goats could sustain an entire family through lean seasons when grain harvests failed. Dairy animals became renewable food sources, and the communities that kept them gained a survival edge that compounded across generations. But fermentation was a workaround, a clever one, but still a workaround. The real shift, the one that would alter the human genome itself, was still coming. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Somewhere in the grasslands north of the Fertile Crescent, probably around 7,500 years ago, a random genetic accident occurred in a newborn. A single-point mutation appeared near the LCT gene on chromosome 2. This tiny change, just one nucleotide swapped for another in billions of base pairs, did something extraordinary. It kept the body producing lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, well past childhood and straight into adulthood. This was not supposed to happen. Every mammal on Earth is programmed to stop lactase production after weaning. But this individual was different. They could drink raw milk as a teenager, as a young adult, as a middle-aged person, without any digestive consequences at all. Fresh milk in large quantities with zero discomfort. Now, in most circumstances, a random mutation like this would have meant absolutely nothing. Mutations happen constantly. The vast majority offer no advantage, cause no harm, and simply disappear from the gene pool within a few generations. But this particular mutation appeared at exactly the right time and in exactly the right place. These communities were already keeping dairy animals. They already had access to milk every single day. And the person carrying this mutation suddenly had access to a dense, reliable, year-round source of calories, fat, protein, calcium, and hydration that literally nobody else around them could use. Imagine what that meant during a drought when the wells went dry and the grain withered in the field. During a brutal winter when stored food ran low and starvation crept through the village. During a famine that killed neighbors and weakened everyone else, the person who could drink milk directly without fermenting it, without processing it, without waiting, had an enormous survival advantage. They were better nourished. They recovered from illness faster. Their children were healthier and more likely to survive to reproduce. And those children had a roughly 50% chance of inheriting the same mutation. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Natural selection grabbed hold of that mutation and amplified it with astonishing speed. Geneticists estimate that lactase persistence spread through certain populations faster than almost any other known human adaptation, rivaling traits like malaria resistance in Central Africa. Within a few thousand years, it went from a single individual to a defining characteristic of entire civilizations. And the spread was not random. It followed the herds. Around 5,000 years ago, a group of pastoral nomads living on the Pontic steppe, the vast windswept grasslands stretching from modern-day Ukraine to Kazakhstan, began one of the most consequential migrations in human history. These were the Yamnaya people, and they were, at their core, dairy people. They kept large herds of cattle, they drank milk, they made fermented dairy products, and a significant percentage of their population carried the lactase persistence mutation. The Yamnaya were mobile, aggressive, and technologically advanced for their time. They had domesticated horses, built some of the earliest wheeled carts, and organized themselves into expansionist clans that needed new pasture land constantly. Starting around 30,000 BCE, they pushed west into Europe and east into Central Asia, bringing their cattle, their culture, their language, and critically, their genes with them. Genetic studies published over the last 15 years have completely rewritten our understanding of European prehistory. Ancient DNA extracted from burial sites across the continent shows that the Yamnaya contribution to modern European genetics is massive, sometimes accounting for as much as 50% of the total ancestry in Northern and Western European populations. The people already living in Europe, the Neolithic farmers who had built the first agricultural communities, were not replaced entirely, but they were absorbed, intermixed, and genetically reshaped on a continental scale. The Yamnaya did not just move into Europe, they fundamentally transformed it, and they brought milk with them. This is where the global map of lactose tolerance starts to make sense. Pull up a chart of lactase persistence rates around the world, and the pattern practically tells the story by itself. Northern Europeans, the descendants of populations that mixed most heavily with Yamnaya migrants and spent millennia herding cattle through cold, dark winters, where dairy was often the only reliable food source, have the highest rates of lactose tolerance on the planet. In Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and the British Isles, roughly 90 to 95% of adults can digest milk without any problems. Move south into Mediterranean Europe, where farming was more grain-based, and the rates dropped to around 50 or 60%. In East Asia, Southeast Asia, most of sub-Saharan Africa, and among indigenous populations in the Americas and Australia, lactose tolerance rates often sit below 20%. In some populations, they are close to zero. This was not about habit or culture or personal choice. It was about genetics, pure and simple. The populations that herded dairy animals for thousands of years evolved the ability to consume their product. The populations that relied on rice or fish or crops other than dairy never needed to. Lactose intolerance is not a disorder. It is not a medical condition. It is the original default setting for the human species. Lactose tolerance is the mutation. We just do not think of it that way because the people who built the dominant global food systems happened to carry it. But the Yamnaya were not the only ones who stumbled onto this trick, and this is the detail that everyone missed for the longest time. The same mutation, or rather functionally equivalent mutations achieving the identical biological outcome, evolved independently in at least 5 different human populations around the world. Pastoral groups in East Africa, particularly among the Tutsi, Maasai, and Fulani peoples, developed their own versions of lactase persistence tied directly to their centuries-long cattle herding traditions. Arabian Peninsula populations developed yet another variant. Each mutation was genetically distinct, appearing at different locations on the chromosome, meaning these groups did not learn it from each other or inherit it from a common ancestor. Evolution literally invented the same solution to the same problem in different places at different times through completely separate random accidents. Biologists call this convergent evolution, and it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire genetic record for just how valuable milk was as a food source. The survival advantage of drinking milk was so enormous that natural selection kept stumbling into the same answer over and over again, independently on at least 3 different continents. For a while after the Yamnaya expansion and the parallel rise of dairy cultures in Africa and the Middle East, things actually seemed settled. Dairy communities flourished. Milk, cheese, butter, and yogurt became woven into the fabric of daily life, religious practice, and economic systems. That stability did not last. The ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia, one of the earliest literate civilizations on Earth, left behind clay tablets describing dairy production in remarkable detail. Temple records from around 4000 BCE list milk, butter, and cheese among the goods managed and distributed by priests. Dairy was not just food, it was wealth. It was currency. It was sacred. Sumerian art carved into temple walls shows figures milking cows into large stone vessels, and some scholars believe that specific cattle breeds were maintained by temples exclusively for their milk yield rather than their meat. In ancient Egypt, tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom period depict milking scenes with startling clarity, showing farmers crouching beneath cows while calves stand nearby. Vessels of milk and rounds of cheese were placed inside tombs as offerings meant to sustain the dead in the afterlife. The Egyptians took dairy seriously enough to bring it into eternity. Researchers at the University of Catania made headlines in 2018 when they identified what may be the oldest known solid cheese inside a burial tomb at the Saqqara necropolis near Cairo, dating to approximately 1200 BCE. The cheese had survived over 3,000 years underground, preserved by the dry desert air, still carrying traces of the bacteria that formed it. Halfway across the ancient world, dairy played an equally critical role in building one of the largest empires in human history. The Mongol armies of the 13th century, commanded by Genghis Khan and later his descendants, were essentially a dairy-powered military machine. Mongol soldiers traveled with herds of horses and mares and survived primarily on arag, fermented mare's milk, along with dried curds called arul that they carried in leather pouches on their saddles. A Mongol warrior could ride for days without stopping for a traditional meal, reconstituting dried curds with water or drinking fermented milk on horseback. This dairy-based logistics system gave the Mongol cavalry a speed and operational range that no settled army could match. They did not need supply trains. They did not need granaries or bakeries following behind the front lines. Their food source rode alongside them, which, depending on your perspective, was either pure military genius or profoundly terrifying if you happened to be standing in their path. So for thousands of years, from Sumer to Egypt to the Mongolian steppe, milk remained a fundamentally local product. You milked the cow or the goat or the mare. You drank the milk or you processed it into cheese or yogurt. The animal and the consumer were rarely more than a short walk apart. The supply chain was as simple as supply chains get. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and milk went from one of the safest foods in the rural world to one of the most dangerous products in the modern city. In the early 1800s, cities across the United States and Europe were exploding in population. As factory jobs pulled millions of people off farms and into cramped, unsanitary urban neighborhoods, these new city dwellers had no cows. They had no pastures, but they still wanted milk, especially for their children. Rural dairy farms on the outskirts of cities could not produce or transport enough to meet this surging urban demand. So a new and horrifying industry emerged to fill the gap: distillery dairies. The concept was grimly efficient. Whiskey distilleries produced enormous quantities of leftover grain mash, a hot, acidic, nutrient-depleted substance called swill. Rather than paying to dispose of it, distillery owners realized they could feed it to cows penned in sheds directly adjacent to the distillery floor. The cows were packed together in dark, unventilated spaces, standing in their own waste, eating nothing but this steaming slop. Many developed ulcers and infections. Many lost their tails to rot. Some were so sick they could barely stand, propped upright by ropes so they could continue being milked until they finally collapsed and died. The milk these animals produced was thin, pale, borderline translucent, and frequently contaminated with bacteria, blood, and pus. To make it look like something a customer would actually buy, producers added chalk to whiten it, plaster of Paris to thicken it, flour to give it body, and molasses or sugar to mask the taste. This adulterated swill milk was then ladled from open containers by street vendors, going door to door, in neighborhoods where families had no way of knowing what they were buying. In New York City during the 1850s, infant mortality in neighborhoods served by swill dairies reached staggering levels. Thousands of babies and young children died each year from what doctors at the time broadly labeled summer complaint, a catch-all diagnosis that covered bacterial infections, cholera infantum, dysentery, and severe dehydration. Almost all of it caused by contaminated milk. Some estimates suggest that swill milk contributed to the deaths of up to 8,000 infants per year in New York alone during the worst periods. The journalist Frank Leslie launched a landmark investigation in 1808, publishing illustrated exposés in his weekly newspaper showing the nightmare conditions inside New York's distillery dairies. His artists drew diseased cows with open sores, workers handling milk in filthy conditions, and children drinking from the same supply that was killing their neighbors. The public was furious, but the dairy industry had deep political connections and paid allies inside city government, and meaningful regulation would take decades of fighting. The same contaminated milk that was killing infants was also a primary transmission vector for tuberculosis, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and brucellosis. Milk was, by a wide margin, one of the most dangerous consumer products in the 19th century industrialized world. A glass of fresh, unprocessed milk handed to a child in 1860 was statistically one of the riskier things a parent could do. The breakthrough came from an unlikely direction. In the 1860s, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur was studying fermentation, trying to understand why wine and beer spoiled unpredictably. Through careful experimentation in his laboratory, he discovered that heating liquids to a specific temperature, around 60 degrees Celsius, for a sustained period, killed the harmful bacteria responsible for spoilage without destroying the fundamental character of the liquid itself. The process, which would come to bear his name, pasteurization, was originally developed for the wine industry. The application to milk was immediately obvious, but adoption was agonizingly, painfully slow. Dairy producers fought pasteurization because it required purchasing expensive new equipment and increased their operating costs. Some physicians opposed it on the mistaken belief that raw milk contained essential vital nutrients that heat would destroy. Others simply did not accept germ theory at all. The idea that invisible organisms cause disease was still controversial in many medical circles. During the 1870s and 1880s, resistance came from every direction. The man who arguably saved more children's lives than any other single figure in this entire story was Nathan Strauss, a German-born American businessman who co-owned Macy's department store in New York. In 1893, after watching his own city's children die from contaminated milk year after year, Strauss began funding pasteurized milk depots at his own personal expense. These were clean, staffed stations in poor neighborhoods where families could buy properly pasteurized milk at prices they could afford. He eventually opened 18 depots across New York and funded similar operations in other cities. Within just a few years, infant mortality in neighborhoods served by Strauss's depots dropped by dramatic margins. The data was undeniable. Clean milk saved lives. Dirty milk killed. If Strauss had stopped at his New York depots, this would already be a remarkable story. But his advocacy pushed the national conversation forward. By 1915, most major American cities had enacted mandatory pasteurization laws. By 1920, the fight was essentially won. Pasteurization became the legal standard, and milk was transformed from a dangerous local product into a safe, shelf-stable industrial commodity that could be bottled in glass, loaded onto refrigerated rail cars, shipped hundreds of miles, stored for days, and sold at enormous scale. The modern dairy industry, as we know it, was born in the space of a single generation. By the middle of the 20th century, milk had become inseparable from the American identity. School lunch programs included mandatory milk cartons starting in the 1940s. Government-funded nutrition campaigns treated dairy as one of the essential food groups. Milk advertisements saturated television, radio, and print media. The dairy industry became one of the most heavily subsidized agricultural sectors in the United States, backed by federal price supports, import tariffs, and industry-funded marketing boards whose budgets ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Then came 1993, and two words that would define food marketing for a generation. Got milk? The campaign created by the advertising agency Goodbye Silverstein and Partners for the California Milk Processor Board became one of the most instantly recognizable slogans in advertising history. Celebrity after celebrity appeared in print ads and television spots wearing a white milk mustache. Athletes, actors, musicians, even animated characters. The message was simple, direct, and blanketed across every media channel that existed. Milk was essential. Milk built strong bones. Milk made you healthy. But the science behind those claims was considerably more complicated than the billboard suggested. And this is where things stop being simple. Multiple large-scale epidemiological studies conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries found that the relationship between dairy consumption and bone health was not nearly as straightforward as the dairy industry had been claiming for decades. A major Harvard nurses' health study tracking over 72,000 women for 18 years found no significant association between higher milk intake and reduced risk of bone fractures. Countries with the highest per capita dairy consumption in the world, including Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, actually reported some of the highest rates of osteoporosis and hip fractures globally. The clean, linear cause and effect story that the dairy industry had promoted on every billboard and in every school cafeteria did not survive rigorous, long-term scientific scrutiny. Simultaneously, a growing global awareness of lactose intolerance began reshaping the entire conversation around milk. Roughly 65% of the adult human population worldwide cannot properly digest lactose. In East Asian countries like China and Japan, the figure climbs above 90%. In many communities across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, the rate is similarly high. For the clear majority of adult humans alive today, drinking a glass of milk means cramping, gas, bloating, and digestive misery. The Western assumption that milk is a universal health food was always a projection of one particular group's genetic adaptation onto the entire species. It was never a biological truth for humanity as a whole. The rise of plant-based milk alternatives in the 2000s reflected and accelerated this shift. Soy milk had been around for decades, but the real explosion came with almond milk, then oat milk, then coconut, cashew, rice, hemp, and a dozen more varieties flooding grocery store shelves. By 2020, oat milk alone was a multi-billion-dollar global industry. Coffee shops in Brooklyn, Melbourne, London, Seoul, and Tokyo stocked more varieties of non-dairy milk than traditional cow's milk. What had started as a niche product for the lactose intolerant became a mainstream consumer category driven by health concerns, environmental awareness, and shifting cultural tastes. The dairy industry fought back with everything it had. Lobbying groups in the United States and Europe spent millions trying to prevent plant-based products from using the word milk on their packaging, arguing that consumers would be confused. The FDA debated the labeling question for years. In the European Union, a 2017 court ruling banned plant-based companies from using traditional dairy terms like milk, butter, cheese, and yogurt on their products. The legal and political battle over what counted as milk became a multi-billion-dollar war fought in courtrooms, legislative chambers, and supermarket aisles around the world. But beneath all the advertising campaigns, regulatory fights, and grocery store shelf wars, the deeper story has never changed. Milk is a 10,000-year experiment in coevolution between humans and the animals they domesticated. The ability to drink it as an adult was never a given. It was never universal. It was earned genetically across hundreds of generations by specific populations who staked their survival on the animals they kept. And that bet paid off so dramatically that it physically rewrote the genetic code of billions of people alive today. The global dairy industry now produces roughly 930 million metric tons of milk annually. Over 6 billion people live in regions where some form of dairy is consumed on a regular basis. Cheese alone exists in thousands of distinct varieties spanning dozens of cultures and centuries of tradition. And yet the fundamental biology beneath all of it has not changed one bit. The majority of adult humans on this planet are still lactose intolerant. The mutation that allows milk digestion remains concentrated in the same descendant populations where it first appeared thousands of years ago, carried forward through the generations like a receipt for an ancient evolutionary transaction. That is what makes this story extraordinary. Milk is not just a drink. It is a living record of human evolution etched into enzymes, chromosomes, and base pairs. Every glass of milk a lactose-tolerant adult drinks is a tiny echo of a genetic accident that occurred in a nameless pastoral community somewhere on the edge of the ancient world. An accident that happened to arrive at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right place, among precisely the right people, therefore snowballing into one of the fastest, most far-reaching evolutionary adaptations in the entire 300,000-year history of our species. The Yamnaya herders who rode west across the European steppe with their cattle 5,000 years ago could never have imagined that their descendants would build trillion-dollar global industries around the liquid their animals produced. The Sumerian priests tallying butter rations on clay tablets could never have pictured refrigerated tanker trucks rolling down interstate highways. Nathan Strauss handing out bottles of pasteurized milk to immigrant mothers on the Lower East Side of Manhattan could never have predicted the oat milk latte. But every one of those moments is connected by a single thread stretching back 10,000 years. A species that learned to take something from another animal that was biologically never meant for it, figured out how to overcome its own genetic limitations and rebuilt entire civilizations, economies, empires, and even its own DNA around that single choice. What survives from this story is not the debates over almond milk versus oat milk, or whether dairy strengthens bones, or how many grams of protein are in a cup of 2%. What survives is the evidence itself, written permanently into the chromosomes of billions of living human beings, proving that a single random mutation and a handful of anonymous ancient herders quietly and irreversibly changed the course of human history. The drink that rewrote human DNA is still pouring. It just looks different now.